In the basement of a laboratory, Dr. Carlos Stoner and the owner of a park are collecting a heavy box. From inside it, they hear strange sounds, which seem to come from an animal in pain. Nevertheless, the two put the box in the truck and the park owner hands over the payment. Before leaving, the guy praises the doctor, saying that he will soon be known as one of the most brilliant scientists who ever lived. Dr. Carlos thanks him for the compliment and the circus man leaves, taking the mysterious cargo with him. The next morning, the scientist heads to a university to meet his old work colleague, Professor Kenny Daniels. He says that he is completing one of his most important research projects and that he needs funding from the university council. In addition, he is looking for a new assistant and Kenny asks what happened to the previous one, called Tim, but Carlos replies that the young man has given up. The professor then suggests one of his brightest students called David Blake, who has just left the class. Dr. Carlos goes after him and finds him being tormented by Steve, a slacker in the class. Luckily, the doctor interrupts the fight and invites David to be his lab assistant. He also claims to be a herpetologist, a scholar of amphibians and reptiles, specializing in snakes. David accepts the job, as he already knows the scientist's reputation, and the two of them make their way to Dr. Carlos' car. When he opens the door, the young man is startled to see a huge snake on top of the seat, but the scientist calms him down, saying that this is his pet, called Harry. The young man soon takes a liking to the animal and they drive to the doctor's house, where they stop for gas. David offers to fill up the tank, but one of the attendants doesn't like to see the young man doing his job and pulls the hose back, spilling gasoline on his pants. The attendant mocks David and goes to check the rest of the car, but as he sticks his hand through the window, the snake wraps itself completely around his arm. The man panics and the doctor quickly tells Harry to let him go, with David pleased to see the snake teaching the grumpy gas attendant a lesson. Minutes later, they arrive at Dr. Carlos' house, where they are greeted by his daughter Christina. David falls in love with her at first sight and the scientist introduces him, saying that the young student is his new lab assistant. Christina asks what happened to Tim, and Carlos replies that he left to look after his sick father. The young woman finds this strange, as Tim had said that his father had perished years ago, but Dr. Carlos says that he got confused and that he went to take care of a sick uncle. After the presentations, the scientist takes David to see his laboratory, which is full of snakes bred in captivity. In addition, the doctor catalogs the snakes with different colored labels, based on their degree of dangerousness. Green labels indicate that the snakes are not poisonous, while those with yellow labels have venoms that are easy to treat. However, snakes with red labels are extremely poisonous and require a stronger antidote. One of them is the black mamba species, which has a venom capable of eliminating an adult human being within an hour. Despite the danger, Dr. Carlos demonstrates skill when he takes the snake out of its cage, grabs it by the head and extracts its venom with a container. He then asks David to help him feed it by injecting the vitamin through a thin hose. Finally, he takes the poison to a cold storage room, where it will be taken to the pharmaceutical industry to be used in antidotes and other medicines. The whole explanation impresses David and he is willing to help the scientist in any way he can. Dr. Carlos is satisfied with this and takes the young man to use an immunizer on his arm to protect him from possible snake bites. The process has to be repeated every month until David becomes immune to any poison. After that, the scientist introduces him to the rarest specimen in the laboratory, the king cobra, considered one of the most dangerous in the world. The doctor warns David to be more careful with it, as this species is afraid of only one animal. To David's surprise, that animal is a small weasel, and when Dr. Carlos takes the cage and brings it closer to the king cobra, it is startled to see its predator. Later, Christina invites David to dinner, and in gratitude, he offers to help with the cleaning. However, the young man begins to feel very sleepy and the scientist explains that it's an effect of the immunizer. However, David feels increasingly exhausted and the doctor calls his daughter to take him to the guest room. As he lies in bed, David quickly falls asleep, but begins to feel something strange, as if his body is on fire. The next morning, David is still asleep, being watched by the doctor and Harry. The scientist talks to his pet snake, saying that he is carrying out an experiment with the young man, capable of taking humanity to the next evolutionary step. Shortly afterwards, Christina leaves breakfast next to David's bed and leaves the house, where a group of visitors has just arrived. They're there to watch Dr. Carlos give a presentation, and he's going to tame the dangerous cobra real in front of everyone. David soon wakes up and goes to watch the presentation, with the scientist confronting the snake in the middle of a fence. Dr. Carlos once again demonstrates his mastery of the species and is about to capture the king cobra when one of the spectators takes a picture with his camera. The flash scares the snake, and for a second it almost attacks the scientist. Nevertheless, Dr. Carlos manages to regain control and calms the animal down, managing to grab it by the head with one swift movement. Everyone applauds the skill of the scientist, who uses the container to collect the venom from the king cobra. Christina then feeds the animal through the hose and ends the performance by taking the animal back to the laboratory. Finally, the spectators leave their donations for the scientist in a container, but by the end of the day they have only managed to collect $18. At dinner time, Christina comments that many people just come to the performance expecting the king cobra to attack her father. David is relieved that the doctor has already been immunized and is therefore in no danger. However, Christina explains that the substance protects him from less poisonous snakes, but that in the case of the king cobra, they have never tested whether the scientist could withstand its venom. After his meal, David goes back to his room to brush his teeth when he notices something strange on his face. Part of his skin is starting to peel off near his cheeks and the same is happening above his eyes. Frightened, the young man goes to see the doctor, who again says it's a normal reaction to the immunizer. As it was created from snake venom, David's body is having a side effect, but it will soon pass. David believes the doctor, but he is also feeling colder than usual, as if his body is more sensitive. Dr. Carlos just shrugs it off, saying that the temperature is really low and that he'll get them both a coat. Later, a police car arrives at the house, bringing Sheriff Dennis and his colleague, Morgan. Dennis used to be a former student of the scientist and asks to check out the property, as he was curious about the scientist's presentations. The doctor agrees and introduces him to his laboratory, where Christina is looking after a sick python snake. Despite its enormous size, it is one of the most sociable species and the young woman asks for help to take it to the shelter before it transmits any diseases to the others. Even though they were unsure, the two policemen carried the snake to the site so that it would remain isolated. Afterwards, Christina says she left some cages open and goes back to the lab, before any of the snakes escape. Without the young woman around, the sheriff questions the scientist, asking if he knows anything about Tim, who is missing. The doctor explains that he quit his job to look after his sick uncle, but Dennis replies that he went to the young man's aunt's house and she hasn't seen him for 2 weeks. In addition, the college students say that Tim was last seen next to Dr. Carlos. The scientist insists that he doesn't know his whereabouts, and suddenly, the python snake begins to stir inside the shelter. This makes the two policemen nervous and they decide to leave and continue the interrogation at another time. Minutes later, the doctor applies another dose of the immunizer to David's arm, who is apparently getting used to the side effects. However, he begins to feel a strange connection with the other snakes, including the king cobra, who is watching him intently inside the cage. Afterwards, Christina shows him more details about their breeding in the laboratory, including a two-headed snake and the young that have just emerged from their eggs. The days go by and everything seems to be going well, with David living with the doctor and his daughter, as well as receiving more doses of the immunizer. One afternoon, David and Christina go to sell the snake venom they've collected, and on the way back, the young man sees a beautiful lake in the distance. He decides to stop by and invites Christina to take a dive together. The young woman accepts, but she warns him that she can't see properly without her glasses and asks David not to stare. The young man promises to keep his eyes closed and the two of them go into the lake and spend an afternoon together. Meanwhile, Dr. Carlos is recording an audio tape in which he tells the results of his secret experiment. He says that David is undergoing transformations in his body, with changes in the shape of his nose and in his body temperature. These symptoms are discreet for the time being, but very soon the young man will undergo a complete transformation. With no idea what's going on, David asks Christina on a date and the two go to the town's amusement park. The place is full of visitors, including Sheriff Dennis and Policeman Morgan, who are competing for the prize in target practice. Despite having trained with guns, Morgan misses every shot and the sheriff shows him how it's done, picking up the gun and hitting every target. Nearby, David and Christina are taking a ride on the carousel when they see a presenter advertising the park's biggest attraction, Snake Man. Christina doesn't think it's real, but the guy challenges her, promising to pay $1,000 to whoever proves that Snake Man is a fake. David gets curious and decides to take a look, but Christina says she'll wait for him outside. Upon entering the tent, the young man finds the Snake Man, a hybrid of human and reptile, with a body covered in green scales. At the sight of this unusual creature, David is impressed and goes to call Christina to take a look. However, Steve, the school troublemaker, turns up and starts teasing Christina. David doesn't like this and the two start a fight in the middle of the playground, with Steve getting the better of him and knocking his opponent to the ground. He then grabs David out of the air, but the young man fights back, attacking him with bites, similar to a snake biting its target. The confusion is soon interrupted by Sheriff Dennis, who who chases the troublemaker away and tells the young couple to go home. A few minutes later, Steve and his friends go to see other attractions in the park, but the young man ends up getting into an argument with one of them and leaves. The guy is still obsessed with Christina and rides his motorcycle to her house, where he sees her through the window. As soon as the young woman turns off the lights, the man starts climbing towards her room. However, as he crosses the window, he runs into Harry, who tries to protect Christina and wraps himself around Steve's arm. Dr. Carlos and David hear the commotion inside the lab and run to see what's happened, when they see Steve falling out of the window. He tries to free himself from the snake, but it's still wrapped around his arm, so he begins to strike it on the head. Christina runs desperately to help her pet, but it's too late and she cries in front of Harry, who lies lifeless on the floor. Steve calls them crazy for raising a dangerous animal at home and leaves, but Dr. Carlos promises that he will pay for it. As soon as he finds out where Steve is, the doctor takes the black mamba, puts it in a suitcase and drives off. Meanwhile, Christina is still mourning what happened to Harry, and David tries to console her by asking her to spend some time alone. In the meantime, Dr. Carlos finds Steve's house and sees his girlfriend leaving in a car. To the young man's misfortune, the girl has left the door open and the scientist manages to break in, where he finds Steve bathing in the shower. Without hesitating, he throws the black mamba into the pit and it bites Steve's foot, injecting its poison. Within seconds, the young man begins to feel the effects, running out of air and having a heart attack, until he falls to the ground lifeless. Afterwards, the doctor takes the snake back and returns home, where David and Christina are having a moment alone. When they hear the sound of the car, the couple run back to their rooms, but the doctor soon realizes what has happened and goes to talk to his daughter. He tells Christina to stay away from David, because a drop of blood could cause a reaction because of the immunizer. The young woman confronts her father, saying that he is hiding something, but Dr. Carlos only says that he is worried about his daughter's safety. Even so, Christina rebels and leaves him alone, without suspecting what her father is doing to her boyfriend. The next morning, David gets out of bed and, looking in the mirror, screams in terror at what he has just seen. Christina hears his cries and goes to his room to see if he's all right, but her father stops her, saying that there's been an allergic reaction to the immunizer. He promises that he will sort everything out and asks his daughter to fetch a new snake that he has ordered. As soon as the girl leaves, Dr. Carlos goes to David's room, where he finds him with a frightening appearance and greenish skin. The young man doesn't know how this happened and asks what's going on, but the scientist just says that everything will be fine and gives him another dose of the immunizer. Soon after, the doctor hears the sound of an approaching car and goes to see who it is. Outside the laboratory, he meets Professor Kenny, who has come to tell him about the response from the university council. They turn down the offer to fund an extension, because they suspect that the scientist has something to do with Tim's disappearance. In addition, the professor informs him that Steve, one of his students, has been found lifeless in his house after having suffered a cardiac arrest in the bathroom. Despite this news, Dr. Carlos doesn't seem shaken and just says that he needs to get on with his work. The professor finds his colleague's attitude very suspicious and decides to take a look at the laboratory to find out what he's up to. However, Dr. Carlos sees the professor passing by the window and decides to take care of the matter. Shortly afterwards, the professor goes to the laboratory window and finds David with his face lowered, as if he were feeling unwell. As soon as the young man raises his head, he reveals his monstrous face, its skin replaced by snake scales. Professor Kenny is startled, but before he can do anything, Dr. Carlos appears and strikes him on the head, knocking him unconscious. After that, the doctor takes his colleague to the shelter and ties him up with chains attached to a padlock. As soon as he wakes up, Professor Kenny tells him to let him go, saying that he has already found out about the experiment Carlos carried out on the young student. However, the doctor isn't intimidated and tells him that he's trapped and there's no point in asking for help, as the shelter isolates any sound. What's more, if the professor wants to escape, he'll have to find the key to the lock, hidden in one of the two cages in front of him. However, he must choose wisely, because one of the cages contains a harmless snake, while the other has a very poisonous species. Finally, the mad scientist leaves, leaving Professor Kenny to try his luck at escaping. Because he also knows about snakes, he suspects that the key is with the most poisonous species. In one swift movement, the professor grabs the key without getting stung, and manages to free himself by opening the padlock. However, he is confronted by a huge python snake, which uses his body to wrap around him and begins to break his bones. The professor screams in pain, but the snake finishes him off, squeezing him even tighter until he runs out of air. Far away, Christina calls home and tells her father that the snake he ordered hasn't arrived yet. In fact, It was all a setup by the mad scientist to keep his daughter away while he concluded his evil experiment with David. Meanwhile, the young man is deteriorating more and more, to the point where he can no longer stand up. He hears Christina's call and tries to call for help on the lab phone, but ends up dropping it on the floor. The scientist ends the call and tells her not to worry, because David is recovering. The young woman then prepares to return, but one of the delivery men overhears the conversation and tells her that he has heard about a rare species of snake that he saw at the amusement park. It's a hybrid of a snake and a human being, but Christina says she's heard about it and it's all a hoax. However, the guy insists that it's real, because as well as having the features of a reptile, the creature has blue eyes, something unusual in snakes. This makes Christina suspicious and she decides to go to the park to investigate further. Minutes later, she arrives at the park and asks the park owner to see Snake Man, but he refuses because it's time for his main attraction to rest. Even so, the young woman decides to go into hiding, and when she meets Snake Man, she notices his resemblance to Tim, her father's former assistant. Now covered in scales and without his legs, the young man has been condemned to be a monster all his life. Horrified to discover the truth, Christina rushes home, fearing that the same thing will happen to David. In another part of town, Steve's girlfriend goes to the police station and tells the sheriff her suspicions about what happened to the young man. She believes that Christina, Dr. Carlos' daughter, was the culprit, as he had gone to her house the day before he was eliminated. Shortly afterwards, the police receive a call from Professor Kenny's wife, saying that he went to visit Dr. Carlos, but hasn't come home yet. Seeing the connection between these events, the two policemen decide to go back to the professor's house to find out more. Back at the lab, David's transformation is almost complete and the mad scientist has David strapped to a gurney. He then uses the last dose of the immunizer on the young man, transforming him into a king cobra. Faced with this frightening event, the scientist celebrates, as his cross-species transformation experiment has finally worked. Now that David has become a real snake, the doctor puts him in the bath and moves on to the next stage of the experiment. He then opens the door of the other king cobra's cage and releases it into the enclosure, as he intends to capture it and carry out a fusion between it and the hybrid snake. As in the presentation, he tries to capture the animal, but the king cobra attacks him with several poisonous bites. The doctor tries to resist, but just as Christina suspected, the immunizer fails to protect him from the poison and the scientist falls lifeless to the ground. Shortly afterwards, Christina arrives home and sees her father lying on the ground next to the king cobra. The animal also tries to bite her and she manages to dodge it, but ends up trapped in the middle of the fence. She's about to become another victim, but fortunately the sheriff and Constable Morgan show up to save her. With his shotgun in hand, Dennis shoots the snake, blowing it up. Christina is safe, but she remembers David and runs to the laboratory, just as he manages to get out of the bath. However, the weasel trapped in the cage also manages to escape and advances towards him, attacking his head. When she arrives at the laboratory, Christina knows that the snake is David and screams his name, while the police aim their weapons at the predator and its prey. Whether David survived or whether there is any chance of getting him back to normal remains a mystery. So what did you think of this movie? Leave it in the comments below. And if you liked the video, like and subscribe for more movie recaps. See you next time.